So today we're going to be going over the tools in the family editor itself and how to model various using the various tools that come with the family editor. So I'm going to create a new family. I'm just going to use a generic, just the absolute generic model template. Rather than dealing with any of the others, this gives me just kind of an empty set to kind of work with. So opening that up, we basically just have our crosshairs here. There's absolutely nothing in this model, so we can be free to work with things however we want. So when you start a family, it automatically opens various views for you. It'll automatically open a 3D default 3D view, your floor plan view, and then like a front and side views. So you'll see we have a very different sort of ribbon up here rather than the typical architectural tab that you typically see in a project. Now that has become the Create tab, and we don't have near as many tabs up here as what we typically do in a project. But the Create tab replaces the Architectural tab as far as the 3D versions of stuff that you can build. So we have some new tools here. We've got Extrusion, Blend, Revolve, Sweep, Swept Blend, and then Void Forms. The Void Forms are the same as what you have here, just the inverse of them essentially. These create solid shapes. These cut away at those solid shapes. So if you hover over each one of these, you'll get a little preview as to what they typically do. So it'll show a sketch, and then it'll show kind of what happens when you finish it. So you draw a sketch, and then you set how much you want that sketch to extrude itself, and it makes it into a 3D form. So that's extrusion. Blends, you draw two separate ends. So you draw one end and then you draw the second end, and it interpolates between the two of them. You can set the distance between those two. Revolve is kind of exactly what it sounds like. You set an axis, you draw a profile or a shape, and it spins it 360 degrees. You can also set that to not spin 360. It could spin 180 or 90 or 30, whatever you really need it to do. Sweep, you sketch two different things. You sketch a path that something is going to follow, and then you sketch the profile that's going to follow that path, and then it basically extrudes that profile along the path that you have set. And then swept blend is a mixture between a blend and a sweep. So you sketch a path and you set one end and you set the other end as two different profiles, and then it'll sweep between the two. And then the void forms of all of those are basically the exact same thing, only cutting away at them. So what we've got here with these tools, you can create almost anything that you want using these five tools. There have been some instances where I've created a absolutely massive model using just these tools because of the amount of kind of customization and different things that these offer. So getting into how these kind of work, if we'll use the most basic one as far as the extrusion goes first. So as soon as I click extrusion, it's going to set the work plane. Since I'm in a floor plan view, it's going to set the work plane as the level that I'm on. So then I've got my sketch tools. Let's say I want to, I'll do a kind of, we'll do just a circle here. Extrusion is one of the tools that you can do multiple things at once. So if all of these are going to be the same height, I can I can set up a couple different things here, and do them all at one time. So I could have multiple shapes going. I can also add little shapes within those. So maybe I don't want that piece to show up. As long as I've got an exterior and an interior shape, it's going to go ahead and make a solid out of this and leave this little piece out. So I could do that on a couple of these. And then once I have my sketch sort of taken care of, what I'm going to do is I'm going to come over here to the properties window. And in the properties window, you'll see I can assign a material to it. I can assign visibility to it. I can identify it as a certain kind of category. And then I can also say, do I want this to be a solid or a void? This will automatically default to a solid if I've selected extrusion. If I selected a void form, that'll default to void. But if for whatever reason I selected extrusion and I meant to select the void extrusion, I can go ahead in here and change that right there rather than backing all the way out. So under the constraints, you'll see I have a start and an end. Which one is the start, which one is the end, it does not matter. I could make this 1 foot and I could make this 0 foot. It's going to end up being the exact same thing. It does not make a difference. These are interchangeable one way or the other. As long as you have the distance between them set to what you want, it'll work out just fine. So we've got our work plane level, we've got our materials, all of that sort of stuff. If we want this to have some sort of adaptability, so let's say we're going to take this family and we're going to put it into a project. This 1 foot is set within the family right now. If I want to be able to adapt and change that when it's in the project itself, I need to set a parameter to it, which is this button over here. So if I click on that, I could say, okay, here's my parameter. I'm going to create a new parameter, and I'm going to call this the height, and I'll throw that under dimensions, which is makes sense given that it's a dimensional kind of parameter that I'm going to be setting here. And then the other things that you'll see within this are, is it a family parameter, which is just basically associated with this particular family, or is it a shared parameter? These can be scheduled, they can be shared. It could be a parameter that is shared across multiple families. So if you change it in one, it could be changed in other ones all at the same time. And then you also have this type option here. Is it a type or is it an instance? And if you remember, we talked about the difference between edit type and just properties. So edit type is the properties window shows you everything associated with this particular item. The edit type window shows you everything associated with all of that particular instance. So if I had a desk here and I changed something in the properties window, it would affect this desk. If I change something in the edit type window, it would affect every desk in my project that has that same particular name. So do we want this to be a type property where when we change it, it affects all of them, or do we want it to be an instance property where it just affects this particular one? Now, I always tend to default to the instance version. And the reason for that is if I have this as a type property and I want to change this particular version of it, I have to duplicate and change it that way. Basically, edit type, duplicate, create a new version of it, and then change it. That's fine. Or if it's something that I'm not going to have a ton of in my project, and maybe there's only like 4 versions of this, and I want to be able to adjust each one independently, or maybe in some instances I want to be able to adjust all of them at once. If I have this as an instance parameter, it gives me the flexibility to change that for this one, or when I'm in the project, I can right click on this item, hit select all instances, it'll grab all of them in the entire project, and then I can change it and it affects all of them. So that gives me the option of doing that if I want to. So I'm going to say it's an instance parameter, and I'm going to go with a family parameter. It's not going to be a shared parameter, and we'll say OK. And then I'll say OK there, and you'll see it grays itself out. And it'll gray it out because now basically that's telling us that, hey, this is gonna be something that you can edit once you get into the project. So there's no real rhyme or reason to you editing it now. So I can also turn visibilities on and off. If I have multiple versions of something, I could save them all in one family and then apply visibility parameters to them, where I could check a box on and off and flip through maybe 3 different versions of something. That's an ability you can do by creating a visibility parameter. And then the material parameter. I'm going to go ahead and create a material parameter, and I'm just going to call this shapes. And I'm going to throw an instance parameter on that as well for the same reason as the dimension one. I want that flexibility. And we're going to throw that under materials and finishes and say OK. And I'll say OK. Now when I hit the green check mark, it's going to go ahead and finish that shape. So if I go to my 3D view, now I have all these shapes that I created, and they're all the exact same height. If I wanted to create ones at different heights, I have to go ahead and do that as separate entities. I can't do that as all one kind of sketch. So now that I've got uh, that taken care of, I can test those parameters that I created. I can either come up here under family types, and it'll open a dialog box that looks something like this, and you can see I have shapes, my material parameter, and then my dimensions, my height parameter. So if I all of a sudden change that to 2 foot and hit apply, everything jumps up to 2 foot. So that seems to work pretty well. So getting into some of the other creation tools here, blend is essentially an extrusion, only instead of one sketch, you sketch one, then you hit edit top, and you sketch the other one, and it'll interpolate between the two. That's pretty self-explanatory, pretty easy to get grasp. If I do sweep, we can go to sketch path, and I can sketch any sort of path that I want something to go on, and then I'll hit the green check mark. You'll see there's this little red dot, and then the line there. That's where my my sketch plane will be. So I need to look at it from basically this direction, looking that way, so that I can see that profile and sketch my shape on it. Or I could go from this direction to either way works. If for whatever reason I don't want to look at it from that angle, like a good example of this would be, let's say I have a curve on the end here, and um, my sketch plane is there. Now I don't have a view that's looking directly at that, which would make it difficult for me to sketch what I want on it. So I can click on that while I'm still editing my path here, and I can click and drag that along, and it kind of skips along my path until I get a view that I want. So I'm going to drag it here so I can look at it from the front or the back view. I'll hit my check mark, and I'll click on this and hit edit profile up here. So if I hit edit profile, it'll come up with some views that are perpendicular to that. So I can say I want the front view. I come in, I can see my little crosshatch here, the red dot being the exact center of that path. And then I can say, okay, I'm going to do some sort of weird shape here. I hit my green check mark once to finish my shape. If I go to my 3D view and look at how this happens, I hit the green check mark again to say, okay, I'm finished editing both my profile and my path, and it'll extrude it along that entire path there. So this is great for things like moldings, baseboards, casings, things that have the same profile that are running that kind of path. It's also great uh, for turning corners and doing three-dimensional stuff in multiple planes. So right now we just create an extrusion that is in basically kind of 2 dimensions. So we drew a path that was just along the reference plane, so our level. So that entire path is all in 2 dimensions. It's just moving this direction and this direction. It's not moving vertically as well. If we want something to move in this direction, and vertically, we can go to create, sweep, and instead of sketch path, we say pick a path. Now we need some sort of reference points to do this. So I'm going to use one of my other shapes that I've got here to create this, but if I hit pick a path, it says pick 3D edges. So I can come down here and say I want it to go along the bottom of that shape, then up that shape, and then go the other direction. So it'll come up, like kind of in the XY direction, then the Z direction as well. I can hit my check mark, and then I can come in and say, okay, I'm going to edit the profile of that. And let's say we just do something simple like we'll just do a sphere. And so then when I hit my green check mark, it'll go ahead and bend that in 3 dimensions. I will say that when you do this, there is the chance that you're going to get an error message and it won't be able to create it for a variety of reasons. There's, depending on what your profile is, how it bends here and then bends the other direction, it can cause a little bit of a discrepancy and cause some errors. And it's just a matter of kind of working through and figuring out, okay, how am I going to do this? So that's basically sweeps. And then swept blends, the thing that most people don't realize about swept blends, or they just tend to forget, is that swept blends can be really handy from the standpoint of you only get to sketch one line. So I can't sketch a line here and then there. I only get to sketch one path, which can be a little cumbersome, not necessarily cumbersome, but limiting. But it also gives you the chance to do various things, like let's say we just do an arc like this. We could draw a circle on this end, a square on this end, and it'll go ahead and interpolate between the two around that path. But there's nothing that says you have to sketch a different profile on either side. So let's say we go to the front view and we've got our two uh, profiles here. Let's say I draw a rectangle here, and I'm going to make this rectangle, let's say we make this 2.5 inches by 1.5 inches. Okay, so we've got our 2.5 by 1.5 inches, and I'm going to select this and I'm going to Control C copy that. And then I'm going to finish that, go over to my other profile, hit edit profile, and I'm going to paste that exact same profile in over here. And I'm going to move it into place right on the edge there. Now, I have the exact same profile on either side, so I could easily do exactly what I've got here as a sweep. That's perfectly fine, and I would suggest doing that as a sweep. But if you want to do something like the railing of a spiral staircase, you're going to have the same profile there as you do here. It's just this one's going to have moved up a certain distance. And that's where this tool can be helpful, because you can draw the exact same profile and then say, okay, I'm bending around the outside. I know how far up I need it to go based on how many risers and stairs I've got. I hit my green check mark and it'll go ahead and bend that up and around. So you can create those kind of shapes like a helix. You could create this kind of helix by just copying this shape up and then mirroring it across, and then you get that helix shape over and over again all the way up. So the swept blend tool can be beneficial if you're interpolating between two shapes, but it can also be beneficial using the exact same profile and just moving that shape up and down to get the start and end points that you want. So if we go ahead, I'm going to go ahead and delete this and also delete our other little sweep here. And I'm going to create a new project. So I'm going to say new, whoops, I do not want a new family. New project. And browse, I'm going to use the default there. Now I've got a project created here that's just going to be a kind of default empty project. If I go into my 3D view of my family, I can hit load into project here, and I'm going to load this in, and you can see I bring it in and it's just a component that I can place anywhere in here. Now that it's in a project, I'm going to go ahead and hide these. That way I can zoom to fit on my little thing down here. So now that it's in a project, I don't have the create tool anymore. I don't have kind of any of the properties that I had before. Now I've got everything to do with this component for a project that I've got going here. Now I created a material parameter, so now I can go ahead and apply a material to these from this project. Without creating that parameter, I couldn't do this. So let's just throw that as a brick. And then let's say I also wanted to make this a little bit taller. So I've got height there. Let's say I make it 3 feet. Now everything jumps up to 3 feet. If I did not create those parameters, I would have to go back into edit family to adjust all of that, which gets to be a little cumbersome going back and forth between the family editor when you could just throw a parameter on it and adjust it in your project. So when I said I made those instance parameters, so I'm going to copy this and get a second version of it over here. And let's go back to our 3D view. Now, because I made those instance parameters, I can adjust this one and say I want this to be 2 foot. This, it does not affect this one. If I had made that a type parameter, both of those would have dropped. I can also apply a different material to this one, and it doesn't affect either one. So if I just make these cherry, see, that one stays the same. But if I have a bunch of these in my entire project and I want to change all of them at once, I can always come in here, select it, right click, select all instances and entire project. It'll grab both of those and I can punch in a height of, say, 2.5 feet. And maybe I want all of these to be copper then. Now all of them change, so now both of these are 2'6", and this one is 2'6" as well. So that instance parameter gives me that flexibility that I want there. So that's a real brief kind of run through of just kind of the family editor and using the kind of tools that they give you up here, as well as a short introduction into kind of parameters and how those work.